Irreverent, entertaining, cool. You're listening to LA Talk Radio.
You're listening to Peace Fund Radio with Ethan Dettenmeyer and Adrian Paul, right here on LA Talk Radio.
How shall I start this one? Boom! Something like that, Ethan? What do you think?
Fantastic.
I think it's a way to get into this show this morning. There's lots
wonderful.
of energy and stuff because we got a lot to talk about, as per normal, which we're not going to have enough time in the hour of doing it, and that's why we're working on maybe extending it, right?
That's right.
Yes, and I know you're going to be working diligently on that. You said you were going to be running after the show. I'm quite impressed about that.
I'm running, but only to a film location. I'm not actually physically running laps like I should. That comes later. I'm going to try to work in a new physical regiment this year and get back to the old ways.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually just beginning to go back after kind of some neck problems.
Anything you care to discuss?
No, not really. Just like tight muscles that cause different blah stuff, you know. But that happens, you know, as you go through life and you get stressed and work on stuff, your muscles tighten up and then your back goes out and your neck's hurting and or your back's hurting or whatever it is, you know.
There's a litany of complaints from you this morning.
I don't complain, I just explain.
Right. I got
Ooh,
you.
I think I should quote that one. I don't complain.
Quick, write that down for the end of the show. Maybe John Beerley can make a note of that.
John Beerley, did you make a note of that?
Yeah.
Is he there?
He's there.
Yes, I just got on. Hi, guys.
Oh, that's
How you doing
good.
this morning?
Did you hear my quote? I think I'm going to be quoted from now on. Don't complain, just explain.
That's good. That's good.
It's
Very
very
succinct.
It's just, you know, it's... I don't know if it stands up to some of the other past quotes we've had, but it's definitely...
No, I'm sure it's not the quote of the year, but... you know, I'll get anything I can get these days, you know.
Right.
Anyway,
Ethan, did you survive last week's mudslides and monsoons? That was a high action call.
It was. We loved it. We loved it. He said the road closed right after
that road closed, and it was on the news moments after I was after it. Moments after I made that call and was on it, actually. Probably within a half hour. That road closed due to severe flooding and mudslides. I mean, the rocks were coming down near my car. But I should have actually gotten out and give you a much more animated Raiders of the Lost Ark type destruction report.
I'd like to think that the officials heard, were listening to Peace Fund Radio and like, oh, man, we got to close that road.
Yeah, you should see it on the news.
Shut him down.
You should have seen it on the news. In fact, the freeway adjacent to it closed as well. It was just a nightmare. I mean, it takes a lot to really, for weather to dissuade me. I mean, I'll work in almost any weather conditions, but this was like tsunami type conditions. It was nuts. It was
I think you might have been proud of me actually working the board last week because I was here on my
actually the other problem was I was so stunned that Adrian was actually doing any level of work that I was not only trying to survive.
We're gonna have to reel that one back in
my road.
Any amount of work that's really pleasant.
Adrian was actually running the tech board and handling a show. I was like, oh my god, my world must be ending. This must be a sign of the apocalypse.
And I took callers too. I have to let you know about
callers,
that.
It
was a full packed show last week.
Action packed everywhere. Action packed at the studio, action packed on the road.
If I wasn't on my phone, I would have given you guys some video. I would have done some filming. I should have. It was actually that crazy with the rocks coming down, but I guess it's not that.
Well, we're going to be doing some interesting stuff, I think, this year. I think we should. I'd love to have an on-the-road reporter. I mean, we'll discuss that because I kind of love live action stuff from different areas. If there was a way to do that, but
you got to turn your fan base into sort of regional.
Yeah, maybe you guys out there can actually create. Would you like to be a Peace Fund reporter? You know, that Peace Fund radio reporter. That'd be kind of interesting. But anyway, we'll talk about that.
The answer is yes, you would, because believe me, this is about as fulfilling a gig as it gets. That is the truth.
Thank you, John. I'm glad you are still with us after. I don't know how many shows we've done now. We've done. I don't know. It was 150. No, what are we doing here?
This is year 4.
I think this is 160.
160. Well, that's not bad.
crazy.
That's getting pretty.
Most TV shows get 8 to 12 to start. We're at episode 160.
Episode 160.
Yeah, no, this is. I just checked. This is number 160.
You see, this is what we have. John is the bearer of information. He's the guy that can bring you all the up-to-date news, views, and reviews on everybody that we have as guests and as a thing. I'm really impressed, John. It's good. Listen, we got to get on to the show because we got to get on children in need. We're going to continue our focus on education, and we're going to talk the discussion about poverty and education. But before I do that, I want to introduce our guest this morning, who is actually just joining the Peace Fund Advisory Board. Edward Keebler, a senior executive who's provided strategy, operations and management solutions to over 150 client organizations in 12 sectors on 6 continents. He's been chosen by a full spectrum of businesses, governments, industry bodies and NGOs for his multidisciplinary cross-sector expertise, intellectual horsepower, keen insight and exacting standards. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful, which it is, and you wonder, what has that got to do with poverty and education? Well, we'll get to that in a second. Good morning, Ed. How are you?
Thanks for having us on.
Having us on,
yeah. me and all of my words.
You and all of your words. Yeah, it's actually kind of impressive. I kind of like that. But you've done a lot as a consultant, and you've worked a lot in the industry. But it's your career, and I'm really happy that you've come on as an advisory member to the Peace Fund, because I think we're going to value a lot of the insight that you'll have for us.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me to participate. It's an honor, and it's a subject obviously very close to my heart.
Thank you. We had a long meeting yesterday. 3 hours. We were talking about a lot of different issues, and that's one of the reasons why I actually wanted to bring you in. We are talking about education and poverty, kids that come from low income areas that need an education, and that's one of the reasons why we're bringing a launch of Surface tablets to 90 new to needy classrooms, 90 of them, where we're going to be doing the voting for 9 winning classrooms between February 1st and the 3rd. We might extend that to the 5th. And our winners will be announced on the February 4th show. But this is about technology and education. Why do we need it? What is important about education, poverty, and how it allows somebody to move forward in life. Now, I know you came through a very tough childhood, and you told me yesterday that you kind of what was the word? You did it because you really had the drive to make things happen and not wallow in self-pity or saying, well, life's not any good, and I'm going to make something out of my life, even though I've had a lot of trauma or stress in it.
Yeah, I actually did wallow in self-pity for an early part of my life, but when I finally hit rock bottom, I realized that the only option I really had was to self-educate and pull myself up by my own bootstraps and proceed forward.
Now you came from a background where you were taught, your father and mother taught you, they gave you technology, or they gave you books as a child, or how was that?
Well, I grew up in a very, very abusive household. So, both parents, physically and emotionally abusive, and then neglectful. And the long-term consequence of that was that I had a very difficult sort of time around my own self-confidence, self-worth, all of those other things as you go through your teen years. And my parents really emphasized education, but in a very aggressively pushed an education agenda for a couple 3 years while I was young, while I was probably in 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. And then they moved on to other things and sort of
forgot you,
more or less. And
Ed, if you don't mind my asking, this is John. And first of all, welcome to Peace Fund Radio and welcome to the Peace Fund. We're very, very happy to have you. How did your parents' attitude towards education affect your own attitude toward education?
Well, originally, it was more or less in an abusive household or an abusive environment, and from my background, nothing was ever good enough. So when you're getting pushed on education, the education outcome winds up being part of the yoke of how the abuse transpires. But what I realized later, as I worked through my own healing process around my background, was that my parents actually gave me a really beautiful gift. Because the ability to have literacy and to self-educate and to self-motivate, once I sort of found out where that bottom was, that ability wound up sort of completely transforming my life with respect to how I would go about self-analyzing, diagnosing, how I would try to heal myself, what kind of help I would look for, to work through the trauma of abuse, and then also what I wanted to do with my career and what I wanted to do with my life and the things that I wanted to achieve out in the world. And so it took me a little while to appreciate it once I got past my early teens. But it was one of the few gifts outside of life and maybe a couple other things that my parents, I was fortunate enough that they gave me.
It's interesting that you were actually able to change that around because, I mean, as you said, you came from an abusive background. You were given some sort of educational tools, if you like, mm-hmm. What sort of made you change your mind? And at what sort of stage of your life were you at when you said, okay, enough, I'm going to make this happen?
I was always very adept. I was very fortunate enough to be very adept at school and but it was always very interesting because no matter how good I was, it was never really good enough for anybody. And that when I finally hit, I always loved learning, and to have it kind of yoked around my neck as some kind of childhood inadequacy was a difficult thing because I actually really enjoyed it. I just didn't enjoy the manner in which it was forced down my throat necessarily, or the consequences of living up to unrealistic expectations. So when I was able to finally, I had other setbacks with respect to personal health from the time I was probably 10 to 22. I was hit by a car multiple times and had all kinds of other health issues. And when I finally, when my mom passed, both my parents passed on, finally I got some space, some headspace around and some physical comfort. And, I had been working for an extended period of time as well from a young age. And so when I finally got some independence and I finally was able to take an inventory of my living and really examine all of the things that I had sort of in my arsenal and take account for my life and what I wanted to do with it, I realized that, wow, I've actually accumulated a great deal of knowledge. I've done a lot of really, my life has been extraordinary to some degree in a negative capacity, but there are a lot of tools and gifts and things that I've acquired along the way that are going to be quite useful, and those were mostly education related, and I found my love of learning again. Let
me ask you another question. You said something, you said about the yoke that was taken away, the way that it was taught to you, the way that education was shoved down your throat. Mm-hmm. How do you think it should have been approached instead of being shoved down your throat, which actually made you take a step back from it rather than accepting it?
Well, education is such a, from my perspective anyway, is such a multifaceted issue with respect to it's not just book learning and arithmetic and everything else. It's arts and it's sciences and it's music and it's social learning and it's the entire maturation process around how people go from being infants to being young adults and then productive members of society, and then for adults in an ongoing, evolving way. And that should be a co-supportive, productive exchange where you're encouraging children to participate in the process of learning, and not crucifying them for their defects or the things that they may have challenges with over the course of their learning.
I think it's interesting because I know that with my kids sometimes I get frustrated when it's a simple thing, or it's seemingly simple to me, and my son's not getting it. And there's the option at that particular moment in time to say, "Oh, don't you get it?" Which is then being detrimental because they close down more, or saying, okay, let's take a step back and try and explain it in a different way so that they do get it. And I think that's the key moment, I think, that you're talking about, which is like getting it shoved down your throat in a detrimental way rather than actually taking the time to actually explain it.
Yeah, in a way, I'm oddly fortunate because so many kids are deprived of, so many children are deprived of education opportunities. And when you combine a deprivation of education and an abusive environment, it's really a toxic and kind of a deadly mix for kids. And I for whatever reason, despite the underlying circumstances or the daily operating circumstances of my young living, my education wound up being a boon. Not everybody learns the same. And, my parents' education focus, as I said, was originally out of a source of embarrassment because I had a very isolated early childhood, pre-K, and had very little pre-K development. And when I went into kindergarten, my teachers were a little bit thought that I might have some learning disabilities, and they brought that to my parents' attention. And my father, proceeded to hit me in the head with a candelabra. And so the evolving circumstance there was that they took a keen interest in my education. Mostly, my mother, I think, specifically knew that it would be a tool that I had something between my ears, and that it would be a tool for me to get out and escape something that she was contributing to and was unable to emotionally escape herself. And my father did it as a sense of embarrassment.
It's interesting because, there are a lot of kids in classrooms that come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. And one of the reasons they might seem unmotivated is because of lack of hope and optimism, because low socioeconomic status and the accompanying financial hardships are really correlated to depressive symptoms, and that gets misconstrued, I think, by teachers as, well, they're slouching in classroom, they're lazy. We know inherently, and it's been proven, that laziness is not a genetic defect. And it might be misconstrued as something else in a classroom in a poor socioeconomic background.
No, absolutely. And what generally happens is that not every child learns the same way. And the ability to connect and apply different teaching tools to children, to get them, to help them in their development, and also unlock the manner in which they most effectively learn so they can optimize their potential is a vastly underutilized, or in my experience and in my opinion, a sort of underutilized toolkit, because the focus on conventional education is so much on standardization. And when you look at socioeconomic status, and you look at the rates of abuse, and you look at school performance, and you look at a number of other factors that contribute to poor performance in school, or bullying, or all of these things are related together.
Mm. You brought up a good point there, Ed, that no two children learn the same, and no two children come from the same situation at home. And there are a lot of studies that show that when a child's early experiences are chaotic, or that both of the parents or one or both of the parents are absent, you get a lot of insecurity and stress on a developing brain. And that can also contribute to what Adrian had mentioned earlier about teachers might think, well, this kid is lazy or this or that, when really it's stress, or as you mentioned before, just the embarrassment of feeling like they're not on the level of their peers.
Well, the stress, I know that it directly affected me in school throughout my entire career, and I was a very isolated child. There's a difference between aloneness and isolation. I was both alone and isolated, and it absolutely reflected on me with respect to social interaction, with respect to classroom performance, with respect to a variety of things. And I found a way, because I had some capability to still excel at subject matter, but was quite backward, I would say, for a number of years, and in peer groups, et cetera, was backward for many years in social interaction and all the other intangible components of how a school, functions and how a peer group functions.
It's interesting. I mean, you've been in the funding world a lot. Through all the stuff that you've done and you've accomplished, as have I in the film industry. And some people have said to me, they said, why do you keep going? You kind of feel that this is going down the wrong road, but you still cling on. And I think one of the things is hope. Hope is such a something that you hold on to, even if it's a small glimmer of hope. That's why we continue down a road sometimes, because it gives us hope that it's going to work out in the end. Doesn't necessarily mean that it will, but that's part of the same issue that kids that have no hope or are helpless don't want to proceed. They don't want to sort of learn or do anything of that nature.
And I was one of those kids. And it took me a while to really understand what my own value was, or to just be obstinate enough not to accept the script that had been replayed in my root conditioning or my core conditioning as a child, which was that I was worthless and I was never going to be any good, or I was going to turn out like my father, which was a mantra that my mother had tried to bludgeon me with for about 10, 15 years.
Well, it's interesting because you really, from your standpoint, there are going to be a lot of kids that go through and will go through exactly what you've done, but most of them won't be able to get out of that mire that they find themselves in, the helplessness that they feel, because if they feel helplessness, they're not going to want to go forward. And most of them don't get out of it. You were probably one of the fortunate ones, probably because you had some sort of inner strength that allowed you to get out of it. But I think we have to help those that don't have that.
Well, and the statistics are really horrifying. The incarceration rate for abused kids versus the standard population is double. Kids who are abused have 9 times greater likelihood of committing some kind of crime, and 2/3 of all the people in drug and substance abuse programs have been abused, and how sort of the seed of education and how my education evolved over the course of time. Even when I was blasé about it, the fortunate seed for that was when I went through a period shortly before my mother died where I was actually homeless for probably 3-4 months. And I knew the end was coming for my mom. And I went to, and I looked at my life and I just said, what am I going to do about this? There were probably, I would say, 15 to 18 times that I had seriously contemplated suicide before I was 18 years old. Mm-hmm. And I got to a point where I had worked consistently to provide for the people around me, and I just was left with nothing, and I was an empty husk of a person. I didn't really understand where I was going to go or what I was going to do. And, I sat down actually at a bookstore, and I read in rapid succession, For the Sake of Argument by Christopher Hitchens, and The Prophet by Gibran, and The Alchemist over the course of about a 2.5-day period. And the poor manager at the bookstore saw, here's this kid with a backpack who's obviously got problems, and I'm sitting in the corner of the bookstore just sobbing hysterically. And she sort of walked around every hour or two while I'm, trying to read through my tears, walk around, make sure I hadn't done anything crazy or nothing was going on. And I got up and I made a decision that day that I was going to get it turned around. And I realized that I had worked so hard for other people and I had abandoned this education pathway, or I had devalued it because of the manner in which it had been delivered to me, but it was ultimately going to be my salvation.
Go ahead, John.
Well, Ed, the best part of your surviving that period of your life and turning it around is that today you are able to tell those stories to people who need to hear it, because there are a lot of people out there who need that help, people who are in similar situations who just need to hear from somebody that I went through it too, and I turned out okay, and you can turn out okay as well. I mean, we've had lots of young teenagers that we featured on our show as our heroes of the week, who are young people who are doing really great things for other people, who have, either done what they've done, either because they had a friend who committed suicide or they had tried to commit suicide themselves, and were able to learn something about themselves that they're able to impart to other kids and let them know that, to come back around to that word hope, that it's out there. And, in your experience, do you feel like there are a lot of people who are hungry to hear those stories from you, people who have been in similar situations you've been able to speak to?
Well, I haven't done a lot of speaking about it publicly. I've told friends and family, and they, distant family, and I have spoken with some at-risk youth, privately when I've been asked to do that, because an introduction was made. And yes, it is an important message. I think, oddly, and this is going to sound absurd, and I don't know what a therapist would say about it, because I've never talked to one, but I think, oddly, the severity of the situation that I went through with respect to abuse winds up as secretly being, there's a pretty deep bottom, and there's a pretty sharp sense of aloneness and isolation and depression that when you figure out how to bounce back, it winds up becoming a really empowering experience. And, telling that story, or at least sharing the process, sort of the process that I went through I would hope, is a productive exercise for young people, because the few people that I have talked to with respect to the issue who are going through it right now, whether they're in foster care or whatever their circumstance might be, they still have a really difficult time with addressing the sense of isolation, aloneness, and the sense of self-worth. And that is, and education and awareness is one of the mechanisms that you can utilize to be able to really overcome some of those things, as well as getting a better support structure or intervention mechanism around you.
I think it's about relationships. It's about an adult's relationship with a child. It's simple, and whether it's a teacher, whether it's a parent, whether it's a caregiver of any sort, if that child feels that person has let them down, when they go to school, they'll view all adults in the same way. And I don't know, you might have felt the same thing, that from your parents, why would you need to learn in school from this adult, and the only relationship you have with the adult is the closest person that you have, and they've let you down? I mean, I think, most kids from poor backgrounds live with only one parent. They don't live with two parents. And that's where they're already crippled in a certain way. They don't have the full support.
Yeah, and having two parents that are abusive to you, and then in isolation and abusive to each other, compounds that. But to your point, I think that in my instance, my parents really highly valued education, but they were constantly being critical of the teachers and the education platform, or combative when they cared to be that way with the school district, which means that you don't really know which master you're supposed to satisfy in that environment, right? You don't know whether you're supposed to satisfy your parents and not get the crap beat out of you, or satisfy the satisfy the teachers in school who are allegedly dunderheads, So but I was actually really fortunate. They're like lily pads in the abyss, where I was very fortunate to have a teacher here or a teacher there who had the courage to try to address the situation in as mild or as inobtrusive manner as possible, because they were concerned about further abuse to me, and were very supportive and were willing to allow me to continue on my education path. And those little blips of light in the darkness have been a huge. I'm immensely grateful for them, even though I may not have appreciated them when I had them. In retrospect, they were transformative and incredibly valuable.
It's interesting because you've got you talked about being a dunderhead, and I think what people don't realize is that actual researchers at the Washington State University. University School of Medicine, they found that poverty also appears to alter the physical makeup of the brain, of a child's brain. That's literally physically. Basically, it means those exposed to poverty at an early age have smaller volumes of white and cortical gray matter, which is the learning portion of the brain, and as well as two things I don't understand, hippocampal and amygdala volumes. I don't know what those are, John.
Okay. The hippocampus is basically the brain's center of emotion, memory, and autonomic nervous system. And then the amygdala, if I am remembering this correctly, also processes memory and decision making and emotional reaction.
See, it's what
we've talked today. Those are all kinds of things that are sort of tied together, especially for these kids who are coming from homes where there is either poverty or abuse. That emotion really drives their ability to have memory and decision-making and processing power.
Which goes back to what Ed was saying earlier on, which is it's a domino effect, which we talked about before, in so many other socioeconomic or social responsibilities of that child, whether it is disruptive behavior in the school, in the classroom, whether it is being able to learn, whether it is a language that they use, all that comes from that one instance of what the adult in the home has actually been able to, where they've been able to guide them to.
Yeah, and that's and that directly leads to substance abuse in young adults, and it directly leads to for severe abuse cases. My understanding is that in instances of six abuse instances or more over the course of a child's life, that generally that child will live anywhere from 15 to 18 years less than standard life expectancy.
Right. And I mean, the other thing I also say that 1/3 of low-income students that begin at kindergarten are not really ready for school, because by the time they reach 4th grade, 50% of them will not be at grade level reading, which is one of the things. You can't read, you can't learn. It's a real simple, mathematics here. And, children from affluent families have higher scores, and children whose family have the least income have the lowest scores. It's a real simple denomination here. Now, we've talked a lot about the problems, etc., and I think we should also look at how to fight some of these issues, and how preschool can, by learning, can fight that poverty and push people forward, or children forward, into a different life, like you were able to do with yourself. I think they show that research in preschool programs, when they are high-quality preschool programs, have an immense change on a child's life, which is why we have really... I mean, this year we've dealt with a lot of different topics. We've really honed in on education in the past month or 2 months, really because it does have an effect on so many other things in life.
Yeah, pre-K also changes infant and young abuse victim mortality, in that, roughly 1,600 kids a year die, as a result of domestic violence and child abuse, and 80% of those kids are under or 5 years old or younger. And the majority of those are not in pre-K programs. They're not in preschool. They're not in pre-K programs. And so it's not just pre-K and preschool development and education. It's socialization, it's protection, it's early diagnosis from caregivers with respect to what the home environment is like, and getting family services involved if there's a really serious issue of abuse. And it also, it's a key formative building block for education success going forward.
As a parent, I would say to other parents out there, those first 5 years are key to a child's development and future, because something as simple, even if you are in an economic stress area, wouldn't you want your child to be able to come out of that, and perhaps later on support you in that by something as simple as reading to them every night? Because I think that's one of the key things we discussed before.
Yeah, we had a hero of the week last week, Rachel Lai, who has a program called Literacy for Little Ones at literacyforlittleones.com. And she lives in Wisconsin, and she has a network of hospitals where for every child who is born in one of those hospitals, every child born, their family receives a package from Rachel that has a book, at least one book, and then information on the importance of child literacy. Her own mother read to her 10 books a day from up until the time she was 5 years old, and that really gave her a foundation for literacy. But when she gets to school and she sees that some of her classmates can't read, and finds out that it was because their parents either didn't have interest or literally couldn't afford to buy books, Rachel kind of took it upon herself at a young age to do that. She's 19 years old now, and for years she's been, supplying her community with reading materials and, the facts and figures that the parents need to.
But this is why, John, I think it's very important to understand that people like Rachel and people and other organizations out there that gives extra curriculum support to preschools and schools are actually really helping society, because without it, you'd have a system that would actually fail. You have to have those things. You have I looked at this research last year as to how charities or NGOs really support this economy, based on the fact that they provide parks, they provide school materials, they provide so many different things. So I think it's extremely important to really bring this topic to the front, because school funding these days sometimes has dropped. We've talked about that. We talked about it last week, because even if you come from a poor background and you have those problems at home, there is some shelter at school if the right school is there to give you, and the right teachers are there to give you the support that you need.
Well, it's especially valuable for first-time parents, because especially in low-income areas, they don't have a lot of training or education about how to parent. And I mean, it's a crapshoot for all of us to some extent. But having a support network around for young parents so that they can help develop really good parenting habits and or take away some of the lessons from preschool and bring them home is a very effective and useful tool. And this country spends $124 billion a year dealing with reported child abuse cases. $124 billion a year between the criminal justice system and between healthcare and between children and family services and all the other associated ancillary costs. And that's just for reported cases and to have infrastructure available to deal with additional cases if they were reported. That's not even talking about underreported or unreported. That's $124 billion is the 60th largest GDP in the world. That means we spend more money on child abuse in this country than to the outcomes that we have. We spend more money on it than 140 other countries each. Their
economic,
than they make in a year.
Wow.
And we're still getting negative outcomes, and we're getting negative outcomes because the support for pre-K, preschool child care, child development, pre-K, kindergarten, and then elementary school, et cetera, going forward, that continuity and that composition or support for low-income neighborhoods that may not necessarily have the variety of options that upper-income neighborhoods do, that support is entirely reliant on the transactional assistance of churches and NGOs and nonprofits, and there's a huge gap that private schools are also trying to fill there, and not every parent can afford that.
There was an article in the San Francisco Public Press by a reporter named Jeremy Adams Smith, who found that school district data showed that in 2013, parents of children at 10 elementary schools had raised $2.77 million, which was more money than those at the other 61 schools in that same district combined.
These were private schools, John?
I believe so. Yes.
So that's because the parents have more money than the public school parents. It's a simple thing. I mean, which then goes into school funding and poverty. I mean, we've got, and we talked about funding. Just believe most people believe that students do better in a well-funded school, and that public education should provide a level playing field for all kids. It should be a level playing ground. But even in the public school system, we talk about is the funding that is given to each different school, is it fair? Now, there are some...
Actually, quickly, those were not private schools. Those were public elementary schools.
Well, that's really amazing then.
Those are public elementary schools, yes, where they were basically bringing in as much as $1,500 per student, which kind of insulates those kids from budget cuts. While meanwhile, at the other schools, the other 61 schools in the same district, you're having staff being laid off, the libraries are falling apart, the computers are outdated, essential supplies like pencils and paper the kids just didn't have.
Yeah, I live on the west side of LA, and that's absolutely true. Both of my children, their preschool and elementary school experience is dotted with PTA ask for additional support because of budget cuts or the impact of program cuts to the school, and when I was involved in school gardening programs all over the city, the disparity between the capability to be able for parents to be able to satisfy those gaps and provide budget refill independently is very, very drastic and dramatic, and the kids absolutely suffer.
I want to ask a question, which is with anybody knows this answer is, why is the amount of spending per state so vastly different for public schools? And just as an example here, in New York, the actual amount of public education money spent on public education in New York per pupil is $18,507, whereas in Idaho it's $6,369. That is a vast amount of difference, which would deprive at-risk students of resources and supports essential for any academic success they might have.
The entire education system, when you think about the structure of the way it was constructed back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and how we've sort of patched it up over the course of time since then, really needs to be rethought to provide early child development, child care, all the way through to post-secondary education. And the discrepancy is sometimes related to property tax, it's related to population, it's related to a number of different factors, and it does create a huge disparity between access and opportunity, not even neighborhood to neighborhood in New York, but state to state, New York to Idaho, or New York to Alaska, or parts of, even parts of Los Angeles, one part of the county versus another.
Right.
And that's a question that a lot of people have tried to tackle. I know Bill Gates has spent a significant amount of money trying to address how we do composition of education in this country, and has looked at a number of different models from all over the world. Korea, Finland, and others, and I know that that a lot of boats have crashed on that shore, and have not successfully addressed that problem. And it's it has to deal with income disparity, and it has to deal with regulation, and it has to deal with teachers and curriculum and a variety of other things. And we're in a transition period now with respect to the knowledge economy and how we train and educate our kids for the 21st century. And we've been failing them to some degree throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the aughts. And hopefully somebody, whether it's during this administration, next administration, et cetera, somebody will take a very serious look at putting, and I know President Obama's put forward some programs around pre-K development, but somebody take a very serious look around modern teaching technique, around modern teaching technology, and we have the ability to get every single kid in this country, especially for the amount of spend that we have, the right education that fits their development capability, and for a reasonable amount of money, and doing that in a way that also satisfies or helps mitigate some of these other challenges that go with low income, poor education, lack of economic opportunity, abuse, et cetera, et cetera.
Several months ago, we actually brought up the fact of how the United States compared to, diplomas and education once it comes to, I believe it was the college system around the world, and the United States failed miserably in where they ranked in the world system of providing the education and the diplomas of children, actually, or young adults, should I say, achieving a level of education or diploma to actually take them through the college system and the university system. And it was interesting how you mentioned a second ago about the way education should be taught. And one of the things we found in our earlier research was that in Finland, for instance, the amount of breaks. This is a simple thing. The amount of breaks kids were given. Here, children get a 10, 15-minute, 20-minute recess. Whereas in Finland, I think it was Finland or Sweden, it was 45 minutes. Now you go, oh my God, how can you? They're not learning anything. But no, to the reverse was actually looked at was the fact that by taking that stress away from learn, much like when I read a script, learning lines, if you constantly try learning it, your brain won't assimilate it. When you are given that space to walk away from it and do something different and come back to it, you learn faster. So I think there is a way that you're talking about here as to the way the education system is structured.
Well, when you look at neuroplasticity and neuroelasticity and how people learn to that point, our education system has become such a retain and regurgitate kind of system where, there is no deep learning or deep understanding of conceptual frameworks, so that the process of learning new concepts becomes easier, right? So when you learn something, it goes into your RAM hypothetically, and you learn it for a test, you learn it for a short period of time, and then it might stick in your hard drive somewhere, and it might not. And the process management around how to learn, how to do deductive reasoning, how to go about assessing problems and evaluating things, part of that is tied to the mechanism of delivery of education. So you have two things. You have how are you teaching people to learn, and what are the mechanisms that you're utilizing to teach them to learn. And in both cases,
not only physical tools like books and pencils, but the emotional tools to learn, by supporting them, by actually, as a parent, supporting your child rather than, saying, hey, listen, don't do this, you've done it wrong, get it, do it better. That doesn't solve anything. I mean, I know sometimes we don't have time, etc. But that is one of the things I think should be looked at. And the second one is what you just talked about, the tools we use at school and the structure of the education itself.
Yeah, and I think that from my perspective, one of the most radical issues when you talk about child behavior and you talk about abuse and you talk about all of those economic impacts associated with it and human impacts based on what we can measure. And this is a very difficult topic to measure because of the lack of reporting and remediation around it. It's not the end of the line. You're not alone, even though you probably feel like you are. And it just takes one book, one outreach, one moment of positive self-worth to really get it turned around. The thing with abuse is that it winds up being a pervasive part of your root conditioning, and it is overcomable. It is an obstacle that can be overcome, and it can. And the triumph of that is something that is for young adults and children is something that can be incredibly uplifting.
Well, thank you for joining us this morning.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
I think it's a great insight. I think people will get a great insight into this. I know John Bailey jumped off this morning. I will bring up. We will be having a new Peace Fund website very shortly. It's just breaking out there. It's coming out possibly next week or the week after. A lot of very exciting stuff on that website, and structurally the Peace Fund as well. I want to thank John and Beverly for bringing us a lot of this information this morning. As normal, John is our Peace Fund Radio correspondent, we call him, because he corresponds on absolutely everything that we do. Also, if you want to actually support the Peace Fund Radio, you can actually sponsor one of our shows, and we will dedicate that show to a person of your choice. So you can also check that out on the Peace Fund Radio and the Peace Fund sites, how you can do that, because that will help us to keep bringing information like this to the general public and to those people that really need some extra leg up, handout, leg up, whatever you want to call it. Ethan Dettenmeyer, I know you've been calling in the background, but you've been working hard on some other stuff in the background there. Thank you for bringing us to the airwaves this morning.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to close it with a quote from Margaret Mead. The solution to adult problems tomorrow depends in large measure upon the way our children grow up today. There is no greater insight into the future than recognizing that when we save children, we save ourselves. This is Adrian Paul and Ethan Dettenmeyer. We'll talk to you next week.
You're listening to Peace Fund Radio with Ethan Dettenmeyer and Adrian Paul, right here on LA Talk Radio.